what I've got supposed to share with you is 28 years of unbroken involvement in ethnic affairs in the multicultural domain. It's a long, long time. Some people have called me an ethnic industrialist. I've made my life out of the fact that there is cultural and linguistic diversity. But while I've actually made my life and actually had my wage paid for it, through it, I think what's also been extremely important for me is the sense that if you derive income from this area, you have to put back. And it is a proposition and a partnership with the communities. And I'm very happy to say that even as a private sector provider, I'm allowed to be a leading advocate without necessarily always being questioned about my motivations. Because the reality is, if you work in this area and you're passionate about this area, why shouldn't you be an advocate for the area? And I think that's my proposition. What's also interesting for me is that, I'm showing my age, I have to see the presentation from way down there, is that I've been able to take many perspectives. So the reality is I grew up as an Italian migrant in Australia at a time, and I don't know if it resonates in New Zealand because your experience of Italian migrants is so very different. The Italian migration to Australia is one of the largest, deepest migrations. In ancestry terms, we number in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And that's a really interesting situation. And it is only one of the communities. But I remember growing up with a need to understand myself. And what was really interesting is in that background trying to determine to what extent you fit in or didn't fit in. And I find the new multicultural debates generally, I wish they were around when I was growing up, because it would have made my adolescent years far, far easier. To the point where I wasn't known as Pino, I was known as Gus, because my Italian name is Giuseppe. Going by Gus, for me, meant that many people weren't able to identify your ethnicity. And it's quite interesting in terms of then when and what you do to adapt, to the point where I didn't want to be seen with my family. I certainly didn't want to be seen with my mother, especially when she went into mourning after the death of my grandparents and wore black all the time. And there were just some really interesting things that took place. But what happened around my life, to some extent was about the university and education generally, was a politicisation. I thought, well, this is not good enough. We shouldn't have to grow up being ashamed of who we are. We need to start negotiating a far different environment in which we live. And I started getting involved in the Italian community. Funnily enough, for me, I'm an agnostic. But my first community role was with the Italian Catholic Federation. And I always remember having to go to all those church functions and just go, yep, I'm not religious and it's terrible, but I appreciate it that if I actually wanted to work with my community, I needed to engage with that. But funnily enough, that exposure and someone who'd studied politics at university led me to go into the inside. And I got invited in to the Department of Social Security Migrant Services Unit. It was a dream come true. You had this merging of your life, your professional life and your interests. And all of a sudden, I started dealing with migrants all across the board. And my claims to fame are, I started the first interpreting and translating service in the Department of Social Security in 1982. That's an extraordinary time. Right now, that department, and it's now called Centrelink, is this huge monster of language and competence and service capacity. But to be there in those first years was quite extraordinary. And I started to understand government. And it was an interesting time for me because I had a manager, and he was Malaysian Chinese, a very interesting man. I learned so much. He talked to me about circular persistence. As a philosophy, don't necessarily have to go direct. You just have to be consistent and keep on going and keep on going. And I've adapted that now in some of my own philosophies, and I now call myself the master of very small victories. Bit by bit, you get the victories. Bit by bit, you build. And I'm going to talk to you about how that works. But it was a really interesting learning for me, actually needing to interact with migrant communities, very different from my own. Because by the time I had actually got through university, we weren't actually receiving Italians anymore. We were receiving Vietnamese, Laotian, Cambodian, Latin Americans coming out of the various political upheavals in that continent. From that, I went to the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales. I was a community advocate, 3 years of trying to negotiate with government. But our difference was that at that time, and I'll explain why these things were happening, we had resources. When I was the Ethnic Communities Council Executive Officer, I had 16 policy staff. That means everything that happened in government, we had a position on. Any issue which was being raised, we had a position on. We had experts in ageing, in disability, in youth, in information, in media, on and on and on. And I'll talk about how these things came about, but they were really interesting at times. And then from there, then it's, if you like, the whole pathway through the Office of Multicultural Affairs, the Human Rights. I was senior conciliator there dealing with race discrimination and the Ethnic Affairs Commission. That is a decade in which I actually understand and learnt systems, because that's what government is. It's a series of systems. People populate government, but it is a series of systems. The more we understand those systems and what is seen as valuable or invaluable or not valuable, the better we are in terms of our advocacy. And then I come out of that and I work as a private consultant, but I work in my own community again, and this time it's through a welfare organisation called COASIT, and most recently through the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council. COASIT was an organisation which I'll refer to ongoing through this presentation because it defines the history of migrant communities in Australia and how they actually developed.